At the dining table, the room buzzed with the usual chatter and clinking of cutlery. It was a typical family dinner, but I could already sense the undercurrent of tension. My parents sat at the head of the table, exchanging pleasantries, while my brother Mark, ever the spotlight stealer, basked in the glow of his self-proclaimed success. He sat next to his new partner, Lisa, who seemed charmed by his animated storytelling. I couldn't help but notice how everyone else hung on his every word, the golden child with his tales of grandeur. But then, the conversation took a turn, and I found myself suddenly the focus of his attention. With a mischievous grin, Mark turned to me and, with a voice just loud enough to capture everyone's notice, said, "So, how's the job hunt going? Or are you still the family's eternal burden?" The words hung in the air, mixing with the aroma of the food as the table responded with an awkward chorus of forced chuckles. I could feel the heat rising to my cheeks, but I stayed silent, my fingers tightening slightly around my fork. This had become a predictable pattern, Mark's jabs at my situation, coated with that ever-present charismatic veneer that left me voiceless. Our parents shifted uncomfortably, and Lisa's smile faltered, as if unsure whether to laugh or sympathize. I caught her eye briefly before she looked away. Mark continued, clearly reveling in the attention. "I mean, we all know times are tough, but maybe it's time to find something," he said, rolling his eyes slightly for added effect. His words were sharp, designed to slice through any dignity I had left, and I could almost see him relishing every moment of it. I wanted to respond, to defend myself, but any attempt would just lead to more ridicule, a verbal sparring match I was destined to lose. So, I opted for my usual defense, silence. I focused on the dessert plate in front of me, trying not to let my frustration show. The conversation eventually meandered to safer topics, yet the sting of Mark's words lingered like a dull ache. The rest of the dinner passed in a blur, my mind only half engaged with the ongoing banter. I felt like an outsider, my presence merely tolerated rather than embraced, and it stung more than I cared to admit. As plates were cleared and the evening wound down, I found myself reflecting on the night's events. Mark's words echoed in my mind, the taunting label of the family's eternal burden etched in my memory. It was a title I refused to own, a narrative I was determined to rewrite, if only for my own peace of mind. And, in that moment, a quiet resolve began to form within me. As the laughter faded and the plates began to empty, I silently gathered the dishes, my fingers shaking slightly with the remnants of humiliation. Each clatter of crockery seemed to echo Mark's taunt, embedding it deeper into my skin. I kept my eyes lowered, avoiding the gaze of my family as I stacked the plates carefully in my arms. I moved towards the kitchen, seeking refuge in the mundane task of clearing away the remnants of dinner. The familiar scrape of cutlery against porcelain helped to ground me, offering a brief distraction from the swirl of self-doubt. I placed the plates by the sink, then paused for a moment, letting the quiet of the kitchen soothe my raw nerves. It was then I heard it. Mark's voice drifted in from the hallway, low, conspiratorial, and unmistakably serious. He was speaking to Lisa, his tone devoid of the mockery it had held during dinner. I recognized the hushed urgency, a stark contrast to his usual bravado. I didn't mean to eavesdrop, but his words were too startling to ignore. He was confessing, of all things, to having fabricated his recent promotion story. "I don't know how much longer I can keep this up," he admitted, his voice edged with tension. "If the company finds out, I could lose everything." It was as if time stopped for a moment. I leaned against the kitchen counter, absorbing the weight of his confession. The vindication was immediate but hollow, like an empty victory. How often had I envied the golden pedestal my family placed him on, only to find it was built on shaky ground. I busied myself with a forgotten glass, running it under the steaming faucet, watching the water swirl down the drain. My mind raced with the possibilities this revelation presented, but revenge wasn't my aim. I only wanted to reclaim my dignity, to find a way to move forward with quiet resilience. As I continued to wash the dishes, their voices faded into the background, the reality of Mark's words anchoring me in the present. This was a new facet of Mark, a glimpse into the fears and insecurities he hid beneath his charismatic surface. It made his earlier taunts feel less personal, less potent. I allowed myself a small, bitter smile, hidden away in the privacy of the kitchen. Here was a man terrified of losing everything while I stood, ridiculed but resolute, ready to rebuild my life from the ground up. The irony was not lost on me. As the evening wrapped up and the family began to disperse, I slipped back into the dining room, my expression calm and composed, carrying the knowledge of what I'd overheard like a secret talisman. Mark's words had stripped away the illusion of his invulnerability, and for the first time I saw him not as my rival, but as someone who was just as flawed and human as the rest of us. And with that realization came a newfound sense of clarity. I didn't need to shout his secret from the rooftops or use it against him directly. Instead, I felt a clear path forming in my mind, a way to quietly reclaim my own narrative and step out from his shadow on my terms. In that moment of quiet resolve, I decided to let the evening's revelations simmer, to let them guide my next steps without rushing into action. The truth had a way of surfacing, eventually steering the world back towards equilibrium. I tucked my secret away for safekeeping, knowing that its power lay not in exposure, but in the quiet strength it lent me. I spent the evening turning Mark's admissions over in my mind, the weight of his deception settling in like an old familiar coat. Deciding not to confront him directly felt both empowering and strangely liberating. Instead, I focused on my own path forward, choosing to channel my energy into something productive. It was time to quietly gather my achievements and take control of my narrative. The next morning, I rose early, the sunlight filtering through my window casting warm patterns on the floor. I sat at my desk, pulling out my laptop with a resolve that felt new and exhilarating. I hadn't updated my resume in over a year, my last professional highlight tinged with the disappointment of being laid off. But I was determined to frame my past experiences not as failures but as stepping stones. Each word I typed felt like a small victory. I listed my accomplishments, my skills, and the projects I had led with pride. There was a quiet dignity in reclaiming the narrative of my own life. I remembered the praise I had received from colleagues and clients, words of encouragement that had been overshadowed by my recent struggles. This wasn't about putting on a facade, it was about reminding myself of my worth. Once the resume was polished to shine, I took a deep breath and began reaching out to my network. I contacted former colleagues and sent messages to industry contacts, rekindling connections that had gone dormant. Each email was crafted carefully, highlighting my availability and eagerness to explore new opportunities. It was a humbling process putting myself out there after the public humiliation, but it was also a necessary step. At first, there was no immediate response. A few days passed with nothing but silence, the uncertainty gnawing at me, but I held on to my newfound determination, knowing that I was building something that could withstand future storms. Then, slowly, replies began trickling in. Former coworkers responded warmly, their words encouraging and supportive. Opportunities started to appear, small possibilities that carried the promise of something greater. The realization dawned on me that I had more control over my life than I had been led to believe during that dinner. My brother's words, once a sharp dagger to my pride, now served as a catalyst. They had pushed me to confront my fears and take bold steps to secure my future. And for that, I felt a flicker of gratitude, strange as it seemed. As the days turned into weeks, I found myself strengthening not only my professional prospects but also my belief in myself. The anticipation of reclaiming my future filled me with a quiet, steady hope. And all of this was happening behind the curtain of family expectations, away from Mark's prying eyes. I knew then, in those moments of solitude and determination, that I was reshaping my identity, not as the shadow under Mark's success, but as someone who could stand on her own with resilience and grace. The unfolding journey was mine alone, and I was finally ready to embrace it, step by deliberate step, without seeking validation from anyone else. The weeks felt relentless, each day melding into the next as I poured myself into reshaping my professional life. My inbox filled gradually, the return of connection promising. One morning, as I sifted through the emails with a focus, a message stood out, an invitation to interview at a prestigious tech firm. My heart leaped, and I read it again to ensure I hadn't imagined it. The interview was scheduled for the following week, and I spent the days leading up to it meticulously preparing. I researched the company, rehearsed my responses, and felt a strange mix of anticipation and nervous energy. On the morning of the interview, I stood before the mirror, taking a deep breath to steady myself. The reflection staring back was one of newfound confidence, yet shadowed by the uncertainty of stepping back into the unknown. Arriving at the firm's towering glass building, I felt a sense of awe. The room buzzed with professionals exuding an energy I missed being part of. The interview went smoothly, the panel's questions challenging yet fair, testing my knowledge and adaptability. I answered with a clarity I didn't know I possessed. Days passed in a torturous limbo. Each time my phone buzzed, my heart would skip, only to crash back to earth when it wasn't what I awaited. Finally, during a quiet afternoon, the call came. The offer was generous and definitive. I had secured the position. I quietly savored the victory, alone in my apartment, where only the walls bore witness to my muted celebration. I sat for a moment, absorbing the reality. It meant a fresh start, a chance to redefine not just my career, but my place within my family, away from the confines of being the eternal burden. For now, I decided to keep the news to myself, timing its revelation for when it would carry the most weight. Mark's specter loomed large in my mind, a constant reminder of their dismissive laughter at the dinner table. But this achievement was mine to hold. With each passing day, I felt the balance begin to shift. The anticipation of reclaiming my dignity filled me with a quiet resolve. I'd learned from this chapter that sometimes, the best revenge is success. It was time to write my story, on my terms, and I was just getting started. Another family gathering loomed, and this time I walked in with a quiet confidence, bolstered by news I hadn't yet shared. The house was vibrant with conversation and laughter, the clinking of glasses a familiar backdrop. Mark was there, sitting awkwardly on the edge of the couch, a noticeable difference from his usual assured posture. I couldn't miss the tension in his jawline, the way his fingers tapped anxiously against his leg. He was unraveling. I joined a group where Mark was holding court, though not with his usual bravado. There was an edge to his laughter, a hollow ring that didn't quite match the words he was saying. I watched him closely, noticing how he avoided eye contact, his smile stretched too thin. Just as the conversation turned towards work, the moment I'd been waiting for arrived. "We're all doing great," he started, his voice a touch too loud. "The firm is just pushing ahead, and my promotion has really put me in a prime position." The words tumbled out with the desperation of a man trying to reassure himself more than anyone else. But I saw the flicker of doubt in his eyes, a shadow that crossed his features just before he caught my gaze. "How's everything on your end?" I asked, my tone light, as if genuinely curious. His eyes darted briefly before settling on a spot over my shoulder, his bravado slipping momentarily. It's fine," he said, the words almost lost in the flurry of distractions around us. The pause was telling. I knew he'd been hoping the question would never come. His slip was brief enough that another might have missed it, but I'd become attuned to noticing the minute details. Our parents walked over, joining the circle and redirecting the flow of conversation. Mark clutched at the chance to change topics, talking about new ventures, travels he planned but likely couldn't pursue. But over the course of the evening, I saw him slip. Snippets of fragmented sentences betrayed stress he couldn't quite contain. It was subtle, but there was an unmistakable crack in that polished armor of his. When the dinner was announced, I made my way to the table, setting myself with a casual grace that belied the anticipation thrumming beneath my skin. I watched Mark from across the table, my mind replaying the assurance I'd gathered over the weeks. He was still trying to project an image, but the shadows under his eyes and the tension in his smile told a different story. As the dinner progressed, I watched him wrestle with his own fabrications, slipping between hesitation and bluster. It was a tangled dance of evasion and pretense. I sat silently, letting the moments wash over me, a quiet spectator in this theater of facades. The food was delicious, the conversation lively, but the unspoken tension between us hummed loud in the air. Toward the end of the meal, I leaned back, watching Mark attempt to steer the dialogue back to safe ground. But the cracks were widening, his control wavering. I could feel the room subtly shift, his previous taunts becoming nothing more than echoes of a past he desperately clung to. As I rose, preparing to clear my place from the table, a gentle smile crossed my lips. It was almost time to share my news, to let the truth settle into the air with an undeniable finality. But not yet. I wanted him to stew a little longer in the pot he'd boiled up for himself, unaware of the profound shift soon to come. The quiet before the storm was both exhilarating and terrifying, echoing the balance of power about to tip in an entirely new direction. The moment had arrived. Dinner plates were scattered across the table, the remnants of a meal mixed with the murmur of casual conversation. I glanced around, ensuring every eye was engaged in the relaxed buzz of family chatter, before I subtly caught Mark's gaze. I announced, "I've accepted an offer from a leading tech firm." Silence cascaded over the table, that kind of silence that settles heavily, leaving everyone suspended in its grip. The clinking of silverware paused, and eyes turned to me with a blend of surprise and curiosity. Mark's face was a tableau of shock. The arrogance that had so often danced in his eyes faltered, replaced by an uneasy stillness. "Really? Which company?" he asked, trying to maintain an air of casual interest, but his voice quivered slightly. "Tech Innovators," I replied, letting the name hang in the space between us. I watched his reaction closely, noting the slight widening of his eyes and the twitch at the corner of his mouth that he quickly tried to suppress. Across the table, Lisa smiled genuinely, the tension in her shoulders relaxing. "That's fantastic," she said warmly, sending a ripple of polite applause through the room. Yet, while others congratulated me, Mark's expression remained strained, struggling to mask the impact of my news. The shift in attention was palpable, a balancing of scales long overdue. I could see it in the way my parents beamed with pride, their focus shifting from Mark to me with genuine excitement. In this brief exchange, the narrative had altered, and the weight of his taunts seemed to evaporate like smoke. Mark attempted to shrug it off. "Well, that's great for you," he said, his voice veering falsely bright. "I've heard they're all right, I guess." But the corners of his eyes betrayed him, the tension there unmistakable. He fiddled with his drink, an aimless swirl, his smile thin and unconvincing. I chose not to respond to his comment, allowing it to fade into the background noise, instead focusing on the warmth of encouragement from everyone else. The sincerity in their voices was a balm, washing away the sting of past humiliations. Even as the conversation resumed, I saw Mark dart a glance toward Lisa, whose expression was a mirror of empathy and unspoken understanding. She met his eyes with a look that seemed to say, "You had this coming." The rest of the evening unfolded in a softer tone, the laughter genuine and the tension diffused. Mark remained quieter than usual, his usual brashness curbed to the point of near invisibility. It was a transformation I hadn't anticipated witnessing so soon, the confident facade he wore now appearing brittle, almost transparent. The vindication tasted sweet not because I had bested him in a public arena, but because I had done so without malice, with only the truth as my ally. It reminded me of the resilience it had taken to navigate those weeks under his shadow, and the quiet strength I had found within myself to not only endure but to emerge triumphant. As the evening drew to a close, I helped clear the table, the quiet camaraderie lingering in the air wrapping around me like a warm embrace. I caught a final glimpse of Mark, his features still contorted in a blend of disbelief and unacknowledged defeat. He hadn't expected this shift, this recalibration of roles, and the realization clung to him heavier than any words could express. Our lives would continue undoubtedly with the usual ebb and flow of family dynamics. Yet in this moment, I knew a new undercurrent had been established, one of respect and acknowledgement, not just from those around me, but from myself as well. The quiet power that came from reclaiming my dignity was profound. As I prepared to leave, I bid everyone good night, my heart light with a triumph that needed no further proclamation. For now, this was enough. I had found my voice, settled my score, and let the truth of my own success resound softly yet unmistakably within the walls that had witnessed so much before. As I gathered my things to leave the family gathering, Mark's figure hovered uneasily near the door. It was as though he wanted to speak, but the words lingered unformed, clinging to his tongue with uncertainty. I paused, sensing the moment deserved to play out. I turned toward him, my expression letting the silence stretch between us. He finally drew a breath, attempting a casual tone. "Congrats again on the job. Must be nice having a fresh start." I nodded. "It is, especially working with someone I admire." I saw the flicker of confusion in his eyes, the cautious curiosity. This was the moment I'd been preparing for, the quiet revenge I knew would resonate without a single word of accusation. I reached into my bag and pulled out a neatly folded letter, extending it toward him. He took it hesitantly, his eyes scanning the page unaware of what it held, and then, as recognition dawned, I watched the color drain from his face. It was a glowing recommendation from his former boss, now my new colleague, who had moved to Tech Innovators months ago. "He speaks very highly of you, Mark," I said, my voice light but laced with an undertone of understanding. "I'm sure he would have sent his regards had he known we were related." His hands trembled as he held the letter, his facade crumbling with each passing second. He looked up, struggling to maintain his composure, but the mask he wore was irreparably cracked. Those words from his boss praising my abilities were a silent testament to the truth I'd quietly uncovered while he was busy fabricating his own facade. I didn't realize," he started, but his voice faltered, unable to weave another thread of deceit in the face of the undeniable. I offered him a, not out of triumph, but with a gentle acknowledgement of the reality between us now. "It's a small world," I replied, letting the full weight of the situation settle in the small space separating us. There was no need for further words or explanations. The note in his hand, the truth it revealed, and the quiet confidence I now exuded spoke louder than any confrontation ever could. He knew I had seen through his bravado, not needing to expose him but allowing the truth to unravel naturally in its own time. As I turned to leave, the room seemed to shrink around him, and I realized this was the ultimate vindication. I had not only reclaimed my dignity but had also exposed the fragility of his pride without lifting a finger to do so. "Take care, Mark," I said softly, offering him a brief nod before stepping out into the night, leaving the door of our family's dynamics forever altered behind me. The room still hummed faintly with an uncomfortable tension as I stepped away, Mark's silence trailing behind me like a shadow that couldn't quite catch up. The rest of the family, slowly gathering themselves after the startling revelation, looked between us, the space between their curiosity and my quiet triumph hanging in the air. My mother's eyes met mine, softening with a realization she hadn't allowed herself before. There was a understanding there now, an unspoken acknowledgement that perhaps she'd been too quick to label me with burdens I hadn't deserved. Mark sat there, the letter still clutched in his hands, his bravado a collapsing house of cards now exposed to the slightest breeze of truth. He no longer held the room's attention as he once did. People drifted, not just physically, but in their regard for him. It was like witnessing an unspoken shift in power, one that required no raised voices or pointed fingers, just the quiet, undeniable presence of reality. My father, usually a man of few words, approached next, his gaze steady and searching. I braced myself for another dose of skepticism, but instead he simply nodded, offering a single, resolute word, "Well done." It was more than I expected and everything I needed. The heaviness of years of comparison and quiet doubt seemed to lift, replaced by a newfound respect nestled in the silence of his approval. Lisa, Mark's partner, crossed the room as I collected my things. Her expression held a mix of sympathy and admiration. "It's wonderful news about the job," she said softly, her sincerity bright against the room's dimming energy. I returned her, grateful for her presence amidst family dynamics that could be brittle and wounding. Outside, the night air felt clean and free, a stark contrast to the heavy atmosphere I'd left behind. I paused by my car, savoring the stillness before climbing in. The engine thrummed to life, a comforting reminder of both motion and progress. Weeks passed, the family gatherings fewer and the tones than before. Mark's calls came less frequently, though there was a humility in his voice when he did reach out, a tentative peace offering of sorts, spoken in halting apologies and tentative attempts at reconciliation. I listened, knowing that time and truth had altered the landscape of our relationship irrevocably. My job at Tech Innovators grew into a career I was proud of, a testament to resilience and quiet determination. My role flourished, and with it, so did my confidence, genuine now, untethered from the shadows of past insecurities. The next family gathering, set in the warmth of an autumn afternoon, was a affair. Conversations mingled around the table, and though Mark joined us, his presence lacked its former edge. He'd grown quieter in demeanor, more thoughtful perhaps, though the trace of our last encounter still lingered between us, a bridge too fragile to cross without care. Yet as the meal wore on, there was a moment, a brief flicker when I caught his eye across the table. It wasn't an apology, not exactly, but there was a recognition there, a nod to the truth that now grounded both of us on a more equal footing. We had navigated through the storm of our rivalry to find a kind of acceptance, tenuous yet propitious end, and so my place within the family shifted, subtle yet profound, no longer overshadowed by Mark or the echo of his once loud bravado. I found myself embraced not just as the woman who had defended her dignity, but as an individual valued for her strength, her persistence, her truth. In reclaiming myself, I had unwittingly redefined the family narrative, not with grand gestures or dramatic confrontations, but through action and quiet resolve. In that, I found a kind of justice that was both simple and infinitely satisfying, leaving behind the remnants of betrayal, nestled into the comfort of hard-earned respect.